You know that moment when life suddenly stops making sense, when everything you've been chasing feels hollow, like the game itself just broke. That's the game over effect. It's what happens when you realize the reality you've been living might only be an automatic illusion, a simulation of meanings you never questioned. You feel the world flicker, familiar, yet unreal. And something inside you whispers that nothing will ever look the same again. But what exactly happens after the game ends? It starts quietly, not with a grand revelation or a lightning bolt of insight, but with a faint sense of repetition, like hearing the same song loop just slightly out of sync. You wake up, do the things you've always done, say the words you've always said, but something feels off. The scenery hasn't changed, yet it seems as if the script is wearing thin. The texture of your days becomes strangely predictable, almost rehearsed. It's subtle at first. Maybe you're sitting in traffic, and the same thought runs through your head again. Or you're having another argument that feels like a perfect replica of 100 before it, just with a different face or setting. You start to sense a pattern, different scenes, same feeling, and in that tiny crack of recognition, something unsettling begins to shimmer through. This is the first glitch. It's not an external event, not bad luck, not a punishment. It's the first visible fracture in the illusion that life is moving forward in a straight, logical line. The glitch appears as déjà vu without the memory, the eerie sense that you've been here before, not physically, but psychologically. The same reactions, the same emotional loops, the same invisible wall that you keep running into no matter how hard you try to improve. Most people call it a rough patch, some call it karma, others shrug it off as coincidence. But if you watch closely, you'll see it's neither. It's the moment reality begins to echo your unconscious patterns back to you, like a mirror glitching in real time. Imagine a video game character walking endlessly toward the edge of the map, repeating the same moves, expecting a new landscape to appear. The problem isn't with the character, it's with the code. You can change the outfit, the dialogue, the scenery, but if the underlying code stays the same, the story keeps resetting. That's what's happening when life feels cyclic. The personality keeps pressing the same buttons, hoping for a different ending. And because the human mind is designed for continuity, it resists the idea that something deeper is wrong with the code. It prefers to blame circumstances. If only I got that promotion. If only I met the right person. If only I moved somewhere new. The mind points outward because it's terrified to look inward, terrified to admit it might be projecting the same movie again and again. You can sense this glitch most clearly in moments of quiet. When distractions fade and the mental noise settles, you begin to feel an odd kind of hollowness underneath your thoughts. The drive to fix, to achieve, to be someone, it all starts to lose energy. For a second, you're suspended in a strange stillness, neither moving forward nor backward. It feels like losing momentum, but it's actually the first taste of seeing through momentum itself. It's not comfortable. The ego's reflex is to panic, to fill that space with urgency, to call an old friend, start a new project, chase a new goal. Anything to keep the loop spinning. But if you resist that reflex, even for a few breaths, you might notice something remarkable. Beneath the static, a quiet awareness is watching the whole thing unfold. That awareness isn't trapped in the loop. It's just witnessing it. That's the true sign the game is faltering, not because life is falling apart, but because the mechanism that once held your sense of self together is beginning to malfunction. What's breaking down isn't reality. It's the illusion of control that held your identity in place. If you trace that glitch closely, really pay attention to how it feels in your body, how it repeats in your relationships, how it shapes your inner dialogue, you'll see it's not random at all. It's intelligence trying to get your attention. The system itself is showing you, it seems. And yet, in the middle of that recognition, another question begins to whisper through the cracks. If the pattern isn't real, what is? The mind will soon start to defend itself, to reassert its stability, to pull you back into the familiar story. It can't afford to lose its structure. That's where the next layer of the illusion starts to reveal itself. the invisible mechanism that manipulates what you think you see. Once you start noticing the glitch, something curious happens. Your attention sharpens, like the world has subtly changed its color tone. You begin to realize that what you see is not necessarily what is. The shapes, meanings, judgments, and emotions that seem to define reality begin to blur at the edges. It's not that the world outside has altered. It's that the lens through which you perceive it has always been tinted, and you're just now noticing the tint. This is where the invisible mechanism begins to reveal itself. It's not a machine made of gears or circuits. It's made of assumptions, a network of interpretations so deeply embedded that you've mistaken them for truth. From birth, your mind has been building this system, layer upon layer of memory, belief, emotional imprint, and survival logic, until it became the filter through which everything passes. You don't see the filter, you see through it. The mind's job is not to show reality. Its job is to create stability. It edits, distorts, and arranges information in ways that preserve your current sense of self. Imagine wearing a pair of glasses that automatically blur anything threatening to your identity and highlight anything that confirms it. That's what the mind does every moment. It constructs a world you can survive in, even if that world is not entirely real. This mechanism is remarkably intelligent. It hides contradictions so you can keep functioning. It makes you believe your emotions are reactions to the world, not reflections of your conditioning. It convinces you that other people are the cause of your suffering, so you never have to face the deeper truth. The suffering originates inside the lens itself. Consider how perception works in daily life. You walk into a room and instantly feel tension. You don't see the mechanism analyzing faces, tone, posture, but within a split second, your mind has already judged, categorized, and decided who is safe, who is not, what role you must play. You believe you're perceiving reality, but you're actually perceiving your programming. The mechanism doesn't just interpret, it protects. Its prime directive is to maintain coherence, to keep the identity intact. So whenever something threatens your worldview, a challenge, a loss, a contradiction, the system immediately generates defense, rationalization, blame, distraction, emotional noise. It doesn't do this maliciously. It does it automatically, like a body flinching from pain. The more attached you are to who you think you are, the more sophisticated the defense becomes. If you could see this mechanism in action, it would look like a constant editing room inside your mind, splicing together fragments of memory and emotion to form a seamless movie called Me. The editing is so quick, so precise, that you never see the cuts. You only experience the finished film and assume it's real-time reality. But beneath the film, raw data, sensations, impulses, silence, are constantly being discarded because they don't fit the storyline. And here's the paradox. This system that keeps you feeling safe is the same system that keeps you feeling trapped. It prevents collapse by preserving the illusion of control. You chase validation because it confirms your storyline. You resist uncertainty because it threatens your role in the plot. Every desire and fear is calibrated to reinforce the identity that's watching the show. If you've ever wondered why clarity feels fleeting, why moments of insight fade so quickly, it's because the mechanism immediately patches the hole. The mind rewrites the event, files it under something learned, and continues projecting the same filtered version of reality. The glitch you saw. It's quietly smoothed over by narrative correction. But occasionally something slips through, a small event, a moment of silence, a strange coincidence that the mind can't explain. You feel it like a static pulse under the surface, an unfiltered glimpse of something raw and unshaped. The mechanism can't categorize it, so it stalls. That hesitation is precious. It's the opening. It's the point where you might glimpse the unedited feed beneath the film. And when that happens, you start to see the cost of this internal manipulation. Every judgment you've held, every repetitive emotion, every identity you've defended, all of them served the same purpose: to keep the story running. It's not good or bad. It's just how the system maintains coherence. But when you realize you've never truly seen the world as it is, only your mind's edited version, a deep unease sets in. You begin to wonder, If perception is this curated, this self-protective, then who is actually living your life? Who's making the decisions, loving, fearing, reacting? The more that question echoes, the more fragile the illusion becomes. And as cracks appear in this invisible architecture, another defense begins to emerge. The mind starts manufacturing enemies, because if it can't maintain control through perception, it will maintain it through opposition. Once you begin to see through the invisible mechanism of perception, something unexpected happens. Resistance. The mind doesn't surrender its control quietly. It shifts strategy. If it can't keep you distracted by illusion, it will keep you busy with conflict. It starts manufacturing enemies, not real ones, but psychological figures projected onto the world, designed to keep your attention locked in battle. You'll recognize this pattern by its emotional charge. The irritation you feel toward someone's opinion, the anger toward a colleague, the bitterness toward an old relationship, all of it seems justified. It feels personal, moral, right. But beneath that surface, there's something mechanical happening. The mind is trying to stabilize its crumbling sense of self by reasserting division, me versus them, right versus wrong, order versus threat. When the old identity begins to dissolve, it experiences that dissolution as danger. Its logic is simple. If I'm not fighting for something, I might disappear. And so it conjures conflict to remind itself that it exists. It fabricates adversaries, both external and internal, and each enemy becomes an anchor point, a way to reinforce identity through opposition. You can see this reflex everywhere. A small disagreement spirals into moral outrage. A fleeting insecurity hardens into blame. The mind latches onto someone or something to explain its discomfort. It whispers, "If only they changed, I'd be at peace." But that's the trap. The mind isn't seeking peace, it's seeking continuity. The enemy provides a convenient narrative thread to keep the story alive. Watch what happens when you're hurt. The mind instantly builds a case, a courtroom drama complete with evidence, witnesses, and verdicts. It replays the scene in loops, editing and emphasizing details that preserve the image of yourself as victim or hero. It's not malicious. It's simply preserving coherence. Pain without a story threatens to reveal something unbearable, the emptiness beneath the character. There's also a subtler layer. The mind doesn't just create enemies out of people, it creates them out of ideas, emotions, even sensations. Fatigue becomes an enemy, doubt becomes an enemy, silence becomes an enemy. Every experience that challenges your self-image is recast as something to overcome, fix, or resist. You begin living in a field of invisible combat, always managing, always defending, never resting. It's exhausting, but it feels familiar, even comforting, because conflict provides orientation. When you're angry, you know who you are. When you're blaming, you have purpose. The mind thrives on the sharpness of that contrast. It would rather burn in struggle than dissolve in peace, because peace threatens its existence. If you trace this pattern in real time, you might feel it in your body first. A tightening in the chest, a rush of heat, a clenching in the jaw. Those sensations are the body's echo of the mind's defense. They're signals that the identity is fortifying its boundaries. If you pause there without trying to fix or justify anything, you can almost see the moment the enemy is born, the precise instant where the self resurrects itself through opposition. It's a remarkable trick. The same mechanism that once filtered perception now weaponizes it. It projects fragments of your own disowned qualities onto others, so you can continue the illusion of separation. You despise the arrogance in someone else because you're unwilling to face your own need for validation. You fear betrayal because you haven't yet looked at the ways you betray your own truth. Every enemy is a mirror, distorted by your own unintegrated reflection. This realization isn't comfortable. The ego will twist it into guilt or self-blame, but that's just another defense. The point isn't to judge the mechanism, it's to see it in motion. The moment you observe how the mind creates its enemies, the spell weakens. You can't unsee the pattern once it's clear. And yet awareness alone isn't the end, because as you start noticing this internal theater of conflict, another layer of the illusion activates: distraction. The mind begins flooding your system with emotional noise, urgency, anxiety, restlessness, temptation. It's a diversion tactic, a desperate attempt to regain control through stimulation. The closer you get to the truth, the more elaborate the defenses become. That's where things start to get dangerous, not because reality is threatening, but because the mind will do almost anything to protect the illusion of itself. There's a moment in this process when the mind realizes something irreversible is happening. Its old tricks, blame, distraction, self-justification, no longer hold the same weight. The cracks are widening. The machinery of illusion, once smooth and silent, begins to rattle. This is where things get dangerous, not because something outside of you is threatening, but because the structure that's always defined your reality feels like it's collapsing from within. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It begins as unease. You start feeling detached from things that once felt urgent. Success, reputation, approval, they begin to lose their emotional gravity. The mind interprets this as danger. Something's wrong, it whispers. You're losing yourself. But what's actually happening is the slow unraveling of identification. The character you thought you were is dissolving, and the system that depended on that character for meaning starts fighting for survival. The fight doesn't always look dramatic. It often disguises itself as sudden emotional turbulence, irritation that has no clear cause, waves of exhaustion, a sharp pull toward old habits or unhealthy distractions. You find yourself scrolling, eating, arguing, buying, anything to reattach to something familiar. The mind tries to anchor itself to stimulation because stillness now feels lethal. This stage can be physically intense. The body starts to mirror the instability of the inner world. You might notice your sleep patterns shifting, your breath becoming shallow, your muscles tightening for no apparent reason. What you're feeling is not random stress. It's the nervous system responding to the ego's fear of annihilation. For the mind, stillness equals death. So it floods the body with adrenaline, keeping you restless enough to avoid the silence that would expose the truth. Dreams often change here too. They become vivid, erratic, scenes of pursuit, falling, confrontation. It's as if the subconscious is rehearsing the mind's final defense. You might wake up disoriented, carrying the emotional residue of battles that never happened. The psyche is working overtime, trying to stitch the old narrative back together before it dissolves completely. What makes this phase so perilous is that it feels like regression. You might think I was doing fine as I was seeing clearly, and now everything's falling apart. But that collapse is exactly the sign that the illusion is losing its hold. The danger isn't in what's happening, it's in the mind's interpretation of it. It labels clarity as confusion, silence as emptiness, freedom as loss. And if you believe those interpretations, you'll rush back into distraction, back into the game. At this stage, awareness feels like standing on the edge of a cliff without a parachute. You can't go back, but you don't know what happens if you fall. Every instinct screams to retreat, to rebuild the walls, to restore the familiar noise of identity. Yet something deeper in you knows that the only way out is through. That awareness, faint but steady, is the signal that consciousness itself is beginning to take over the game's controls. The mind, however, doesn't surrender easily. It intensifies its projections. It sharpens your perception of threat. Small inconveniences suddenly feel catastrophic. Old wounds reopen. People close to you might seem distant or reactive, mirroring the turbulence you're experiencing inside. It's not coincidence, it's coherence. The world starts reflecting your inner dissonance with unnerving precision, as if reality itself is testing your ability to stay still while everything shakes. If you observe carefully, you'll notice a rhythm. The more clearly you see, the more the mind scrambles. It throws you emotional grenades, guilt, nostalgia, fear, anything to pull you back into the storyline. But each time you resist the impulse to react, something shifts. The noise gets a little thinner. The urgency feels a little less convincing. You begin to sense that the drama is self-generated, that the so-called danger exists only within the mind's interpretation. This is the threshold. Cross it, and you'll start to see the reflection that exposes the entire illusion. But the mind doesn't want that to happen. It will try one last trick: repetition. It will loop the same emotional themes, the same disappointments, the same relationships in slightly new forms. It's not random, it's the system trying to reboot itself by replaying the past. That's where the next revelation begins. When you realize life keeps presenting the same scenes not to punish you, but to show you what you haven't yet fully seen. The reflection itself becomes the teacher, quietly revealing the pattern that insists on being understood. At some point, after the turbulence and the looping chaos, a strange stillness begins to form around you. It's not peace, not yet, but a pause. The emotional noise starts to lose its authority, and you begin to notice something uncanny. The same patterns repeating themselves in slightly altered forms. Different faces, different locations, same feeling. As if life itself were a hall of mirrors, reflecting your inner state back at you again and again until you finally recognize the source of the projection. You meet someone new, and they evoke the same insecurity you thought you'd outgrown. You start a different job, and somehow find the same dynamics, the same feeling of being unseen, unappreciated, misunderstood. The storylines shift, but the emotional script stays identical. This is the reflection, not metaphorical, but literal in how your consciousness uses the outer world to show you what you still can't see directly. The illusion begins to expose itself here, because what you once called bad luck, fate, or karma starts to look less like an external punishment and more like an internal echo. Each recurring event is a signal from the deeper intelligence beneath your conditioned identity, replaying scenarios until you perceive the hidden pattern generating them. The game isn't against you, it's reflecting you. When you start to see this, it's disorienting. The mind doesn't like the idea that what it calls reality might be feedback. It wants linearity, not reflection. It wants cause and effect, not coherence. So it argues, it can't be me, I've changed, I've learned, I'm different. But the universe doesn't respond to what you know, it responds to what you are still being. It mirrors your unexamined frequencies, not your intellectual intentions. Think of it like light passing through glass. If the glass is clear, the light continues unaltered. If the glass is stained with old colors, shame, resentment, fear, the light emerges tinted, distorted. The world then appears colored by that tint, and you believe the problem lies outside the glass. Only when you turn and look directly at the glass itself, your own conditioning, does the distortion make sense. This is what reflection really means. Not philosophical insight, but literal perception of the invisible filter. You begin to see how your tone of voice, posture, expectations, even micro-decisions feed the cycle. You see how a single belief, I'm not enough, people always leave, I need control to feel safe, can orchestrate entire life scenarios. The reflection doesn't accuse you, it educates you. The world becomes your feedback loop, your living mirror. It's often in the quietest moments that the reflection hits hardest. A sudden déjà vu in an argument, a familiar ache in the same emotional spot, a conversation that feels like a rerun from years ago. The realization lands with both clarity and discomfort. I've been here before, just in different costumes. The illusion isn't that life repeats itself, it's that you believe the repetition was someone else's fault. As this understanding deepens, the need to judge others begins to crumble, not out of moral virtue, but because it no longer makes sense. You can't be angry at the mirror for showing your reflection. Every person, every frustration, every unmet desire becomes an extension of your own internal landscape. The characters that once triggered you start to look like fragments of yourself, returning home for integration. And yet, this seeing comes with a peculiar pain. Because the more you recognize the reflection, the more you realize how much energy you've spent trying to fix shadows, people, events, outcomes, instead of addressing the light source. It's humbling to see how elaborate your defenses have been, how passionately you've argued with versions of yourself wearing other people's faces. But this humility is the opening. When the reflection is finally seen for what it is, something inside begins to relax. The compulsion to chase, to defend, to prove, it all starts losing velocity. The game loses some of its grip. You don't yet know what's beyond it, but you sense that the scenery of your life is only a surface expression of an inner architecture that's now starting to shift. And just when you think you're beginning to understand it, when you start to feel the strange relief of self-recognition, a deeper layer reveals itself. Because behind all the mirrored repetition, behind all the patterns and projections, lies a truth far more destabilizing. The realization that you never controlled any of it. What you thought was personal effort, personal will, personal success. It was all movement within a larger current that was never yours to command. There comes a moment, often quiet, almost anticlimactic, when the illusion of control finally cracks. You've replayed the same patterns, tried every strategy, and wrestled with every version of yourself that the mirror of life could produce. Then one day, without ceremony, you notice that the wheel keeps turning regardless of what you do. And for the first time it truly lands. I was never driving this vehicle at all. It's not an idea. It's a visceral recognition that slips under the intellect like a current. You see it in the most ordinary scenes. The conversation that unfolds in a way you didn't plan. The random event that derails your careful schedule. The sudden emotion that rises from nowhere. You realize that the mind, which has spent a lifetime narrating, predicting, and managing outcomes, was never actually in control of any of it. It was simply commentating on what was already happening. This moment can feel both liberating and terrifying. The identity that once found comfort in effort suddenly feels suspended in open air. Without control, who are you? Without the illusion of steering life, what keeps you safe? The mind scrambles to reassert its authority, constructing new beliefs disguised as spiritual insight. Maybe I can learn to control by surrendering. Maybe letting go is just another method. But deep down, you sense the truth. Even letting go is not something you can do. It happens through you, not because of you. Watch closely, and the evidence becomes undeniable. Every heartbeat, every breath, every thought, all of it arises spontaneously. You don't choose them. They appear. Even the impulse to make a choice emerges from a web of causes you didn't create. The more you look, the less you find a solid you behind the process. What you called control was merely a series of reactions, automated by conditioning, genetics, and circumstance. The driver's seat is empty. At first, this realization can feel like collapse. The nervous system reacts as if the ground itself has vanished. For years, control has been synonymous with safety. You've organized your identity around cause and effect, around the belief that effort determines outcome. When that scaffolding falls away, there's a trembling sense of exposure. The world continues, but the central character you thought was orchestrating it has lost its throne. Notice what happens next. A strange clarity begins to seep in through the cracks. Without the weight of "I must," perception sharpens. The trees move, people speak, decisions unfold, all as before, but the tension is gone. Life continues to happen, but it no longer revolves around a controller trying to manage it. It becomes more like watching weather patterns move across the sky. Thoughts come and go like clouds. Events arise and dissolve without the same personal gravity. There's a paradox here. The less you believe in control, the more coherent life becomes. Without interference, things fall into a kind of natural alignment. Decisions seem to make themselves. The timing of events feels synchronistic, effortless. It's not that everything turns perfect, challenges still arise, but the struggle against them fades. You begin to notice that even the difficult moments are part of a broader intelligence at play, one that doesn't consult your preferences, but somehow knows the precise conditions required for awakening. And in that observation, something profound shifts in your relationship with responsibility. You stop trying to manipulate the outer world and start listening to what it's reflecting. You realize that your choices were never about forcing reality to comply, but about responding to its unfolding with awareness. Control transforms into participation. You're no longer the actor forcing the script, but the awareness through which the play performs itself. This understanding doesn't dissolve the ego in one stroke, it simply exposes its fragility. You can still feel the reflex to plan, to secure, to grasp, but it's thinner now, almost transparent. The machinery keeps spinning, but you see the gears, and once seen, their authority weakens. The mind may still claim control, but you know it's bluffing. You can watch its attempts to predict, to label, to panic, all with the same calm recognition. It's just the system doing what it was designed to do. Then comes a subtle shift in perception. You realize that the surrender you've been chasing isn't something you perform, it's something that happens the moment resistance stops. When the illusion of control drops, reality no longer needs to be managed. It simply reveals itself. And just as you begin to rest in that realization, fragile, luminous, unsettling, something even deeper stirs beneath it. The sense that the truth itself, the one you've been approaching, has always been right here, hidden in plain sight, waiting to surface. After the collapse of control, there's an unexpected quiet that follows, not the triumphant peace you imagined, but a stillness that feels raw, almost alien. The noise of striving has subsided, and what's left is something naked, almost too simple to believe in. You can't tell if you've lost something or found something. The mind, stripped of its usual tools, doesn't know how to categorize this new kind of awareness. But in that confusion, a faint clarity starts to shimmer through like light refracting through water. It begins in subtle ways. You might notice that your thoughts no longer land with the same authority. They pass like shadows across a field of perception, temporary, insubstantial. The sense of me that used to feel so dense, so constant, starts to loosen. The world doesn't revolve around that point anymore. It's as if the gravity that held the self together has weakened. And in the absence of that pull, something quieter begins to rise from underneath, a knowing that doesn't belong to thought at all. At first it feels like remembering something ancient, not an event, but a quality. You catch glimpses of it in ordinary moments, watching light move across a wall, hearing the sound of wind through trees, noticing the pulse of your own breathing. Everything seems to carry a kind of silent significance, though you can't say why. The ordinary world hasn't changed, but it no longer feels ordinary. The veil of interpretation has thinned, and for the first time, reality seems to be revealing itself without commentary. This is the instant when the truth begins to surface, not as a revelation or a vision, but as a simple recognition. What you've been seeking was never hidden. It was only obscured by your insistence on looking for it. The truth isn't something new entering your life. It's the background that was always there, finally unmasked when the noise of seeking stops. You might feel it as a deep sense of familiarity, like returning to a place you never really left. There's an intimacy to everything. Objects, sounds, even other people seem infused with a kind of transparency. You're no longer staring at life from a distance. You're inside it, dissolved within its movement. The boundary between observer and observed begins to blur, and with it, the subtle assumption that you were ever separate from what you were witnessing. But this emergence of truth is not always serene. It can also unsettle the nervous system. The simplicity of what's being revealed clashes with the mind's addiction to complexity. The intellect starts asking questions it can't answer. If this is all there is, how do I live? What happens to meaning, to purpose, to effort? The mind is terrified of simplicity because it can't control or interpret it. And yet, despite its protest, the simplicity keeps expanding, eroding the layers of pretense like a slow tide, reclaiming the shore. What's surfacing now isn't an idea about truth. It's truth experiencing itself through you. It doesn't arrive through understanding, it arrives through absence. When the habitual need to define, defend, and direct dissolves, something vast begins to move in its place. You can sense it in the body, a grounded stillness behind every breath, an openness in the chest, a subtle resonance that doesn't belong to thought. The strange thing about this moment is that nothing spectacular happens, and yet everything changes. You start realizing that the most profound shift isn't in the content of life, but in the seeing of it. You don't need to fix anything because nothing is truly broken. You don't need to protect yourself because there was never a separate self in danger. The truth, when it surfaces, doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives like a quiet correction, reality reasserting itself after a long misunderstanding. And still, the mind continues to flutter, trying to reclaim ground. It whispers, This can't be it. There must be more. But that very thought is the last veil, the final move of the game trying to keep itself alive. You begin to see how the idea of becoming enlightened or finding truth is itself part of the illusion, another objective built to keep the player in motion. Something inside you recognizes that the real discovery isn't a new truth, but the collapse of the search itself. And that realization, so simple it almost feels absurd, marks the edge of the boundary you've been circling all along. Because just beyond this recognition, waiting patiently in the silence, lies the twist no one expects. The understanding that there was never a game to win, or even a player to win it. You always imagined the truth would arrive like a breakthrough, a revelation that would blow open the walls of your understanding, expose the secret architecture of existence, and hand you the keys to some higher dimension of clarity. But when it finally comes, it doesn't roar. It dissolves. The discovery no one expects is that the entire pursuit, the spiritual chase, the inner drama of awakening, was never necessary. Not because it was wrong, but because the one who was seeking was part of the illusion itself. It hits in a single, almost absurd flash. There is no game. You might laugh, or you might cry, not out of emotion, but out of the sheer simplicity of it. All the effort to wake up, to transcend, to become, was just another move in the same self-perpetuating maze. The mind had cleverly disguised its will to survive as a quest for liberation. Every meditation, every insight, every philosophical conclusion was part of the game's own continuation. And in that instant of recognition, the house of cards collapses, not because it's destroyed, but because you see that there was never a card in the first place. The realization is disarming. The mind expects that game over means the end of life as you know it, an apocalyptic cessation of meaning. But instead, it's the end of illusion, the quiet vanishing of the imagined player. The body still moves, the world still spins, conversations still unfold, but there's no longer a someone steering it, interpreting it, defending it. The machinery of reality continues, but without a central character to claim ownership of it. At first, this can feel like nothing at all. No divine vision, no choir of angels, just a striking ordinariness. Dishes need washing. The phone rings. The dog wants to go outside. Yet, beneath this simple flow, everything hums with a quiet lucidity. The absence of the player reveals the astonishing autonomy of life itself. It's always been moving perfectly on its own, even when you thought you were controlling it. The discovery is so simple that it feels almost insulting to the mind that spent decades searching. That's why so few people see it, not because it's hidden, but because it's too obvious to be believed. The mind thrives on complexity. It cannot imagine that the answer it's been chasing is the very ground it's standing on. And when this dawns, an odd laughter bubbles up from somewhere deep. You realize that all your victories and defeats were the same event wearing different costumes. The meaning you attributed to them was part of the same play, the illusion of a linear journey. The idea of progress collapses. There was never anyone moving from ignorance to enlightenment. There was only the dance of consciousness pretending to forget itself and then pretending to remember. This isn't nihilism. It's not about nothing mattering. It's the recognition that mattering and not mattering were both part of the same dualistic design. Reality doesn't need meaning to exist. It is meaning, unfragmented, self-sufficient, effortless. What the mind once called purpose is simply the movement of life expressing itself through infinite forms. In this moment, perception becomes extraordinarily clear. You see that everything is happening simultaneously, thought, emotion, sensation, action, all arising in the same field of awareness that you are not separate from. There's no distance between the observer and the observed, because the observer never existed independently in the first place. The seer, the seeing, and the seen collapse into one seamless happening. And yet, the mind doesn't disappear. It still speaks, plans, remembers. But now it's transparent, like a radio playing softly in another room. You can listen without mistaking it for yourself. The thoughts no longer anchor identity. They simply pass through the open space that was always here. What's astonishing is how normal everything feels. The mystical dissolves into the mundane. There's no ecstasy or final explosion of light, only the clarity of what has always been. The search ends not in transcendence, but in intimacy with the ordinary. The truth was never beyond life. It is life, naked and unfiltered. And as this understanding settles, something extraordinary unfolds in silence, a freedom that carries no euphoria, only deep simplicity. The struggle to fix, define, or justify vanishes, replaced by a gentle recognition that existence is self-moving, self-balancing, self-complete. There's nothing left to protect or prove, because there's no one left to win or lose. But even this, the mind tries to name, to categorize as awakening, enlightenment, realization. And that too becomes visible as another move in the game that no longer exists. Which is why the next unfolding arrives quietly, like dawn light spreading across the horizon, the collapse of the internal narrative itself, the moment when even the story of awakening dissolves into the transparency of being. When the discovery sinks in, that there was never a game, never a player, something fundamental begins to unravel. Not externally, but in the innermost architecture of your perception. The mind, which for years has narrated every moment, assigning roles, victories, defeats, causes and effects, suddenly loses its script. The narrator's voice falters, its sentences trail off mid-thought. It's as if the story that once ran beneath every experience has lost its rhythm, its justification for existing. You might not even notice it at first. You just sense a kind of spaciousness where once there was commentary. Moments stretch without labels. The world, stripped of adjectives, becomes startlingly immediate. The tree is just a tree. The breath is just breath. The conversation happening across the room doesn't require an opinion to exist. The machinery that used to generate identity through constant storytelling is no longer being fed. This collapse feels both freeing and disorienting. The ego, deprived of narrative fuel, starts to flicker like a candle in low oxygen. For so long, it built coherence through story. My progress, my trauma, my lessons, my future. Without that scaffolding, there's a weightless quality to experience. You find yourself living moment to moment without the invisible thread that once tied everything together. There's no longer a central character trying to make sense of the plot. Life simply unfolds, wordless, precise, unedited. It's astonishing how much of human experience depends on that inner narrator. Even suffering in its familiar form requires a story. Why this happened, who's to blame, what it means for me. When the story disintegrates, the suffering can't sustain itself. Pain may still arise, but it lacks continuity. It flares and fades like weather. You realize that most of what you once called pain was not the raw sensation itself, but the narrative orbiting around it. Without narrative gravity, even sorrow becomes transparent. But this phase is not the romantic stillness people imagine. The collapse of narrative can feel like standing in a world without landmarks. The mind, deprived of context, tries to rebuild meaning. It offers fragments. You should write this down, you should explain this, you should turn it into teaching. But the impulse to interpret collapses under its own weight. Words no longer fit. Even the idea of understanding feels like a step backward, a return to the illusion that life needs to be summarized to be real. There's also grief in this. The story, however false, was intimate. It gave structure, purpose, a sense of continuity. Letting it dissolve feels like watching an old friend fade into fog. But gradually, the grief itself becomes part of the same clarity. You see that what's dying isn't you. It's the commentary that pretended to be you. The silence left behind isn't emptiness. It's spacious awareness, untouched by description. In this wordless expanse, perception becomes unbelievably tender. Everything is vivid, raw, immediate. You might find yourself crying at nothing in particular. A sound, a glance, a piece of sunlight trembling on a wall. There's no story attached, only pure contact with existence. It's as if life has been waiting all along for you to stop narrating long enough to actually see it. This is the real transformation, not a change in what you experience, but in how it appears once the interpreter disappears. The world doesn't alter, the observer does. Or rather, The sense of a separate observer vanishes, and reality is seen from within itself. Actions still happen, words still form, the body still moves, but everything unfolds spontaneously, without a storyteller claiming ownership. The mind may occasionally try to resume its commentary, but it sounds faint, almost comical. It's like watching an old movie you once believed was a documentary. And here's the subtle paradox. Life without narrative is astonishingly simple. Too simple, in fact. So simple that the mind begins to feel uneasy again. It can't stand the quiet clarity of direct experience. It starts whispering its old seductions. Maybe this is too passive. Maybe you're losing ambition. Maybe you should re-enter the world with a new story, a spiritual one. The narrative, though weakened, still knows how to lure attention back into motion. This marks the next unexpected turning point, the moment when the very simplicity of truth becomes its own challenge. Because when everything becomes this effortless, this clear, the human mind doesn't know how to stay there. It starts to complicate again. It starts to resist. It starts to fear the vastness of ease. That's where the next layer of revelation begins. The freedom that paradoxically terrifies us. When the internal narrative dissolves, what's left is an expanse so wide and quiet that it almost feels dangerous. The old architecture of thought, identity, purpose, self-definition, collapses, and what remains is pure openness. For a brief moment, it feels like peace. Then, almost immediately, the unease begins. Because this kind of freedom is not the pleasant liberation people imagine. It's a vastness with no handrails, no storyline, no one to consult about what comes next. It takes time to realize that the mind wasn't afraid of suffering. It was afraid of freedom. Suffering gave it shape, direction, a reason to exist. Freedom, in contrast, removes the familiar walls. It strips away the narrative gravity that once held you together. Without those reference points, the mind feels like it's floating in an infinite space with no center. For most people, that emptiness is unbearable. They rush to fill it with new goals, new philosophies, new missions, anything that restores a sense of movement and meaning. You can see this reflex play out in countless ways. Someone glimpses the stillness beneath all thought, then immediately tries to turn it into a project, to live more consciously, to stay in the now, to teach others what they've discovered. The mind can't help it. It takes even awakening and folds it back into its survival program. The story rebuilds itself using spiritual language. The player who was supposed to have vanished sneaks back in, now disguised as the awakened self. The irony is profound. Freedom arrives and the first instinct is to escape from it, because in this boundless openness, there is no identity to hold on to, no script to rehearse, no ladder to climb. The mind, which has always defined its worth by contrast, success against failure, growth against stagnation, doesn't know how to exist in a reality where nothing needs to be achieved. Simplicity, in this sense, feels threatening. In the absence of narrative, even pleasure changes its texture. You begin to see that much of what you once called joy was simply the relief of escaping discomfort for a moment. Tension released, not true peace. Without the pendulum of craving and aversion, that cycle stops. What remains is stillness so neutral that the ego labels it as boredom. But if you stay there without reaching for stimulation, you start to perceive the depth inside that neutrality. It's not absence, it's fullness without form. This is the threshold where most people retreat. The mind longs for complexity because it makes existence feel significant. To sit in simplicity feels like disappearing, and yet disappearing is exactly what's happening, not to the body, but to the false center that once claimed ownership of everything. This is why freedom feels so destabilizing. It's the death of the one who was supposed to be liberated. The paradox deepens as daily life continues. Work happens, conversations flow, laughter returns, but now without the same personal weight. There's nothing to prove, nothing to fix. Decisions emerge naturally, as if life itself were deciding through you. The rhythm is effortless, but the ego interprets that ease as danger. It whispers, "You've stopped caring, you're losing your drive." It can't comprehend that action can arise without a controller, that intelligence can move through stillness. For a while, this tension plays like a subtle war, the simplicity of being versus the complexity of becoming. Each time you try to reattach to a storyline, you feel its artificiality more clearly. The old ambitions, the need to be someone, the desire to improve, they start to sound hollow, like echoes from another lifetime. The mind keeps searching for familiar walls to lean on, but they dissolve the moment it reaches out. What remains is a radical kind of presence, intimate and weightless. And gradually the fear begins to thin. What once felt like emptiness starts to feel like freedom's true form, unbounded awareness, neither grasping nor rejecting. You start to see that the simplicity you once resisted was the intelligence behind everything all along. It's not passivity, it's clarity. The impulse to control fades, replaced by quiet participation in what's already unfolding. Yet even here, the journey of seeing isn't over. Because when fear loses its grip, another recognition quietly rises from beneath it, one that feels even more complete, even more disorienting in its honesty. That this freedom isn't the end of the game at all, because there never was a game to end. What you thought was a finish line is simply life continuing, free of the one who believed it was playing. And that realization, quiet, unassuming, absolute, is where the real game over begins to reveal its meaning. When the game dissolves, nothing truly ends. Only the illusion of playing does. Life continues, but without the invisible weight of me pushing against it. Every sound, every decision, every breath unfolds effortlessly, untouched by the need to win, fix, or prove. Game over isn't defeat. It's awakening to what was always here before the game began. The battlefield turns into simple ground. The character disappears, and only life remains, vivid, unfiltered, whole. If you felt this clarity move through you, write in the comments, "I see through the game." That way I'll know you made it to the very end. And if you want to keep exploring this quiet, lucid space where reality reveals itself, choose one of the videos now appearing on your screen. Each one continues this unfolding in a different way.